Well, we are right at noon Mountain Time, so we'll go ahead and get started, and I'm sure people will continue to trickle in. Hello, and welcome to the session entitled Writing Across Engineering, a Transdisciplinary Action Research Approach to STEM Writing. My name is Michael Todd, and I'm one of the Associate Directors for this year's IWAC conference. Before we begin, a few technical reminders. During the presentations, please ensure that you are muted, particularly as we will be recording these in speaker view. To ask any questions, you can use Zoom's chat function. I'm sure that most of us are pretty familiar with that by this point in our Zoom lives. And I believe that is all the most important stuff for us to know. I'm going to pass it over to the session chair, Paul Pryor, to introduce the panel or speakers today. Thank you all for being here.
Hi, welcome everyone. I'm going to share a screen at this point.
There, Paul, the slides are up.
Okay, so this session is Writing Across Engineering and Science, a Transdisciplinary Action Research Approach to STEM Writing. And I'm chairing the session, and I'm involved in this project, and Bruce Kovanen, Nicole Turnipseed, and Megan Miracle, who all worked as graduate or are working as graduate research assistants in this project, will be also presenting on their experiences. I'll be setting the stage a little bit at the beginning. A couple of things changed in the long lead time between our initial proposal and this presentation. One is we used to be writing across engineering. We're now writing across science and engineering. And the other is that after a long period of support from the Academy for Academic Excellence in Engineering Education at the College of Engineering, we also received National Science Foundation support starting in 2020. We have a website where there's further information on the project, and that I'll be referring to again briefly. Bruce, next. We want to begin with land acknowledgements, which are more expansive given the virtuality of the meeting. I'm currently speaking from Chicago, which you can see an image of in my background, and I'm using the land acknowledgement from there, University of Illinois at Chicago. We'd like to acknowledge that the University of Illinois at Chicago resides on the traditional territories of the three fire peoples, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi, purchased after 2.5 years of open warfare, decades of violent encroachment, and the defeat of a pan-Indian movement to keep settlers out of the Great Lakes region at the Treaty of Chicago in 1821, receiving their final payment before moving westward in 1835. The area was also a site of trade, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other native tribes. The state of Illinois is currently home to more than 75,000 tribal members, and the Chicagoland area is currently home to one of the largest and most diverse urban native communities in the US. Illinois is also the territory of the Ho-Chunk, Miami, Anoka, Menominee, Sac Fox, and their descendants. By making a land acknowledgement, we recognize that Indigenous peoples are the traditional stewards of the land we are now occupying, living here long before Chicago was a city and still thriving here today. As we work, live, and play on these territories, we must ask what we can do to right the historic wrongs of colonization and state violence and support Indigenous communities' struggles for self-determination and sovereignty. Verbal recognition of our place as settlers on native land is just one very small step toward reconciling the continued harm of colonization. In the spirit of shared action to support our interconnectedness, we encourage you not just to become familiar with the native communities whose land you occupy, but to make material contributions in support of their well-being. And Megan has dropped some things into the chat in the interest of that. Next slide. So the Writing Across Science and Engineering program began with an transdisciplinary team formed in 2016-17. And by transdisciplinary here, we mean that there were faculty and graduate students from the College of Engineering and from writing studies. And we began with a needs analysis of writing and engineering. We surveyed faculty in writing intensive courses and also the departmental administrators responsible for staffing those courses. We interviewed faculty. We mapped department curricula, trying to see the vertical movement of writing across the 4 years of undergraduate work. And we analyzed course materials and sort of triangulated those against the surveys that we saw. Based on local evidence and discussion, we have since then engaged in a transdisciplinary action research project centered around 3 elements: annual, semester-long weekly workshops, which have been somewhat disrupted by COVID, sustained course faculty mentoring, which has continued, and institutional interventions working toward program and course redesign and professional development activities. By transdisciplinary action research, we mean a couple of things. One thing is that our partners in engineering, graduate students and faculty and academic professionals have been fully engaged in this project from the start. Our group meets weekly during the academic year and a few times every few weeks during the summer. And we've engaged in very detailed conversations with one another and have been involved in sort of co-running all aspects of this program. The other thing is we're doing research throughout. We didn't just do an initial needs analysis, but have continued to research what's happening in courses, how different interventions we've made have been taken up and used, the mentoring and so forth. And you'll see some of that in the presentations that Bruce, Nicole, and Megan will be giving. Next slide. This is our WAES workshop. This is once each year, a semester-long sort of faculty community workshop where people come each week during the semester. If you look at this, it's a pretty routine kind of set of things for writing across the curriculum: response, process, writing to learn, portfolio assessment, source use, citation practices. The second thing I think is that that is a little bit different is that all of these programs are co-led by engineering and writing studies faculty. So we're not just coming and giving workshops, which is something I did for 25 plus years, but actually working with the faculty who are co-giving those workshops. Next slide. The sustained mentoring of courses and faculty and the institutional interventions are something that I didn't do during those 25 years of WAC work. Part of what this is involved is mentoring has been offered as a follow-up to the workshops, aiming to build an expanding community of practice. But it's also been offered to faculty who have approached us, or in some cases to faculty we've approached in strategic opportunities for affecting pedagogical or curricular models. The mentoring has been quite varied. It's ranged from a series of meetings with a faculty member over a semester to assist in designing or redesigning like one assignment, to sustained interactions across years with faculty and teaching assistants in a course to redesign process, writing to learn, response, and assessment practices sort of iteratively as we go forward. In both of these, mentoring has involved, again, writing studies and engineering members of the team doing the mentoring. Institutionally, we work to add writing to first-year introduction to the major courses, to encourage greater attention to writing and TA professional development, and to prompt reflection in departments on the vertical integration of writing in specific majors. One of the things we found very early was a big hole in that, where there was a lot of writing happening in senior design courses, but often not so much happening in the first 3 years, and especially at the first year. We also designed, I should say, and piloted a writing studies course for graduate engineering students, designed both to support their own writing in engineering and reflection on that, and to as well support them as teaching assistants potentially. And John Gallagher designed and taught that course, and Megan Miracle has been researching it. Next slide. We've published in a set of proceedings in TCQ and forthcoming in ATD on this project. And these are the publications. Most of these are connected, can be linked to from our website other than the TCQ. I also highlighted here in blue and red the writing studies and engineering STEM faculty involved in this project, and who are graduate students in bold, or not in bold, and who are faculty or academic professionals in bold, to kind of indicate that we've kept co-publishing with people as well. Julie Zillis is the PI of the project, and following STEM practices, she tends to be last in all of the lists, which marks her as sort of like the lab director of our project. So with that, I'm going to turn it over now to presentations from first Bruce, then Nicole, then Megan.
Great, thanks, Paul. So my portion of this talk, I'll be sharing a little bit about longitudinal collaboration and mentoring that I've done with a member of our physics faculty here at UIUC, primarily focused on our shared inquiry around how students collaborate in newly designed inquiry-focused lab environments, and then to talk a little bit about the research I've done there and some of the sorts of curricular interventions that we've made. Like Paul mentioned, as we're sort of far-flung geographically and coming together in this virtual space, I'd like to offer a land acknowledgement from where I am speaking from in Champaign, Urbana, Illinois. So I'd like to begin my part of this presentation by recognizing and acknowledging that I'm on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and the Chickasaw nations. These lands were the traditional territory of these Native nations prior to their forced removal. These lands continue to carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for survival and identity. As a land grant institution, the University of Illinois has a particular responsibility to acknowledge the peoples of these lands, as well as the histories of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of this institution for the past 150 years. We're also obligated to reflect on and actively address these histories and the role that this university has played in shaping them. This acknowledgement and the centering of Native peoples is a start as we move forward for the next 150 years. So first I want to kind of provide a timeline, and I think this really speaks to the longitudinal work of mentoring that our project has undergone. And in this case, over the past 3 years. So I first met Professor Matt Salen as a participant in our WAES workshops series that Paul described in the earlier slides that we were doing in the physics department. And after that semester had wrapped up, we reached out to him to see if he'd be interested in mentoring. And in particular, Matt's really expressed an interest in having someone come in and conduct research and examine student collaborative activity in this new lab environment that he had designed with then graduate student Katie Ansell. And we took him up on that offer. And then over that next year, I was in and out of his labs, collecting about roughly 10 hours of video and audio recordings of laboratory interactions, 200 completed lab reports from students, and rubric feedback that Matts would give to students. And then over the summer of 2020, sort of based on these sort of emerging preliminary tentative findings from data collection, I continued work with Matts and Katie to develop a few short instructional videos around collaborative writing for pre-lab activity. So that's something that students would do the sort of week before a lab early on in the semester. And we've continued that collaboration not only with the videos, but also then developing and circulating student surveys, particularly looking at attitudinal perspectives regarding writing and its relative value in the STEM disciplines, in part to get a sense of where students are at when they arrive in maths classes, but also as a prelude to future broader student surveys our team plans to circulate as part of our NSF research. In terms of where this work is going now, currently co-authoring a manuscript on literate activity and instructional lab environments with Matts and Katie as co-authors. So I want to start is to briefly mention some of the sort of curricular changes that were already ongoing when I joined Matts and Katie in this work. And their primary focus was moving from a sort of quote unquote cookbook model of lab instruction to a more inquiry focused lab environment. And the sort of central feature of those changes is the device featured on the right. It's called the Interactive Online Lab, or the IL Lab. It's a small handheld device, as you can see here, sort of with a variety of different sensors that measure things like force, acceleration, light. And when students enter the lab environment, they're given a common task. It's up to those lab groups to decide, what sort of sensors do we engage in this experiment? How do we design something that'll collect data that we can use? And that's sort of been the overarching project of a lot of these curricular revisions, is to have students themselves design the experiments using the IL Lab, making decisions about what sort of data they need to generate and how to interpret it, and then compose lab reports that describe their findings, usually in 1 to 2 pages, that are completed in the course of the lab environment. And so this is the sort of environment that I entered, and where Matts was really interested to understand, how students were using the device, how are they working together, to generate these lab reports and these data. So as part of that work, I ended up collecting quite a lot of data from a few different sources. So I have a few of these things here. The first image is a portion of rubric feedback that Mats would give to students that he collated into an Excel sheet for me. In addition to that, I have about 200 PDF copies of completed student lab reports, which is what we see in the image on the left, where students have put together an image and the table looking at the relationship between voltage and light. For a smaller group of students, I also have their shared Google Docs, which I've used a Chrome extension called Draftback to analyze. It gives you sort of like writing analytics. So for those who are maybe a little bit unfamiliar with this, like the second image here, we can consider the y-axis, the position in the document that they're working, and then the x-axis being time. So you see as students are moving along, as time is progressing, they're going further and further, sort of working down the lab report. What is also interesting is to see places where they jump back up to the beginning of the document, or also looking at these sort of bursts of collaborative activity where there are these sort of multiple dots represented, which means that students are adding to the Google Doc at the same time that they're writing on the document concurrently. And then, of course, as I mentioned, the sort of last thing I did was audio and video recorded laboratory interactions. And so that's an image of me posted up in the background with a camcorder and the audio recorder there, looking at students working in situ. So what was sort of the result of some of this work? And Paul kind of alluded to it. Some of this is going to be coming out in ATD here shortly. But what some of our sort of preliminary and tentative data started to suggest was that students were generally not very familiar with working in collaborative settings, and especially not very deliberate about each group member's role. And even though there were things that Mats had done in the lab report to kind of focus students on that, asking them at the end of their document to sort of list out their names and then say who did what. What I found was, going back and looking at recordings of students as they are writing those sections, often didn't really reflect like what people actually did, and it was more a way to account and try to make everyone look like they did a roughly amount the same, even though that often wasn't the case. And from research, particularly in science education, not being deliberate about division of labor can have detrimental effects on who does what in lab environments. So the study mentioned below, the Quinn et al. Found that there are really disparate impacts around gender in terms of who is doing what in lab environments. And this was also kind of an interest of Katie as well, and her work with Mats to think about how do we have students work together. So what we landed on was thinking about, well, we could do a few short instructional videos. So that's what we decided to do, is sort of like a pre-lab activity. These are videos that were maybe a little bit under 2 minutes a piece, and I made 2 of those that sort of introduced students to writing studies concepts about team writing in collaborative environments, and how to really bring that to student attention as they're going into their first collaborative writing experience in the lab. And from what I've heard from Mats and Katie, it's been pretty successful. And the last time I checked the media space this morning, the videos had been viewed over 7,000 times. So I think that's been a helpful addition to some of the work of that class. And then the image on the right here is a part of a survey that we had sent out to students, particularly looking at attitudinal perspectives on their confidence and ability to write, a question about growth mindset, and then asking them to think about how much of their writing that they do is collaborative or not. And that's kind of where we've kind of moved. A lot of our current work is developing student surveys that kind of came out of this class, but now we're going to use for other classes as part of our NSF work. And as I mentioned before, this work with Mats and Katie continues as we work to kind of share some of this results and these data. That's where I'll end it now and pass it over to Nikki.
Great, thanks, Bruce. I am just going to drop access copy of my talk here in the chat in case that's how you'd like to engage today. Bruce, if you can flip one slide forward here, we'll move back to that one in a second. First, I just want to acknowledge the land that I'm on, where the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it's been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Bruce, if you want to slip back, there we go. So our WAES model has enabled some valuable flexibility in how we support members of and groups within our larger community of practice, with the goal of meeting them where they are and addressing their situated needs. So in the mentoring case I'll be discussing, that flexibility provided an opportunity for a deeply engaged, longitudinal and large-scale mentoring project in a class with a large teaching staff that included a faculty instructor, 5 TAs, a mix of undergraduate and graduate students, and a technical research writer in the physics department. On our campus, as I imagine on some of yours, teaching assistants make up a significant portion of writing pedagogy contact with students. Our physics department, like many others facing the persistent need to secure grant funding, employs designated grant writing experts whose facility with technical writing often draws them into more directly pedagogical roles, working with students in curricular and extracurricular capacities. Neither group was targeted by the initial faculty learning community model of the WAES project, and for good reason. Neither is likely to have the time or the interest to participate in weekly workshops on top of their existing duties. Nevertheless, both groups are integral to the work of supporting STEM students' literate development. In this presentation, then, I'll give a glimpse into the intervention and its effects on course materials, the teaching staff's conceptions of writing, and their pedagogical practices in order to consider what this case suggests about practical, sustainable ways to support TAs and academic professionals' work and growth as important participants in our community of practice. Slide, please. So this intervention spanned 3 iterations of the course, Global Physics/Global Studies 280, a non-technical course about the development of nuclear weapons and attempts to control them, which typically meets each spring. We began the mentoring project in the spring of 2018 after the faculty member participated in the WAES faculty learning community, Matthias there on the slide. Another graduate student member of the team, Johnny Oratomo, had TA'd for the class previously and did so again through the first 2 years of our mentorship. So he was the other team member assigned with me on this project. And I was at the time one of the assistant directors for the Center for Writing Studies. So pooling our time and participation really enabled the scope and depth of this project. At the start, John and I met weekly to sketch out suggested changes to materials, which we'd then present at the weekly course staff meetings for discussion. And over time, we sort of gradually stepped back and watched the teaching staff initiate those conversations, and we began to act more as observers and resources as they filled those roles in various ways that you'll see through this presentation. Slide, please. To give you a sense of the scope of the intervention, this is a slide the faculty mentee, Matthias, presented at a community practice event detailing changes made to the existing course materials following the first semester of mentorship. You can see here we added writer's memos to each of the existing assignments. We combined 2 assignments into one where students could choose their prompt and added a peer review where they would respond to students taking up the other prompt, so they still got that content coverage. Created new grading rubrics for each of the assignments. The following spring, I believe, we revised every assignment and overhauled the course website. So some pretty extensive changes to the materials. But what I really want to highlight in this talk is how our collaborative approach to those material changes were a reflection of and a catalyst for the course staff's changing conceptions of writing and their changing pedagogical practices. And perhaps most importantly, how that approach supported their shared inquiry and action, inviting continued reflection and innovation over time that's been really valuable for the course staff and the students. Slide, please. So the existing response mechanism for the course, which they called grade deduction sheets, were co-constructed by the current teaching staff for each assignment each semester using the previous year's archived notes as a jumping off point. So this is a typical example of one with a tight focus on adherence to formatting specifications, standardized language conventions, and correctness of content. That was highly structured in the assignment prompt to begin with. This approach to response, while it did communicate Matthias's disciplinary valuing of technical correctness, it did so to the exclusion of other goals for student learning that Matthias had really honed in his time in the faculty learning community. Next slide, please. So the rubric we introduced then was intended to create space to talk about professional values and expectations regarding technical correctness, while also putting it in perspective relative to other course learning goals. We organized the rubric into features that were consistent across assignment prompts, but might vary in importance between the prompts, focused on different genres and different technical content. So you can see here, this initial design included space for a description of how each feature related to the particular assignment prompt, space for comments related to each feature and the paper overall, and a space to easily mark students' effectiveness on each feature. This range column also included space to add weight to each feature to signal to students the relative importance of those particular features on a given assignment. And most importantly, to get the teaching staff talking to one another and to students about their understanding of the assignment goals and genre. We shared each draft at the weekly staff meetings, where the group collectively revised the draft to fit their evolving response practices and their evolving understanding of students' needs. While taking some of the onus off of the change off of the TAs, this process still enabled us to stoke conversation and group decision-making in the existing space for staff discussion. After the initial intervention semester, the staff decided to make the rubrics available to students at the outset of each assignment and continue to collectively revise each rubric before posting it for students. Slide, please. This is intentionally blank because there's a lot of text on these, so go back to the blank one for a second. So you may be getting a sense here of how important and useful it was that the group already had a practice of meeting weekly to discuss course business. It wasn't a huge leap or too big of an ask to focus some part of that existing time on these change efforts. I think of this as a little bit of luck combined with a very intentional approach of meeting folks where they're at. Next slide. Another bit of luck, especially for the research here, is that the course staff had an archive of their plans for the TA-led weekly writing labs spanning back to 2015, so long before the intervention. A comparative analysis of the sets of writing lab plans from each year show marked change between beginning in the year of the intervention, 2018, and continued evolution since. Comparatively, the lesson plans predating the mentoring are short and minimally descriptive. The language around working with writing assignments in lab was brief. For example, discuss assignment X or go over peer review. And that was the extent of what they had to say about the peer review itself, that kind of thing. And more detailed descriptions are reserved for activities dealing with technical content, which occupied more writing lab time than Matthias thought they should. That was one of the reasons he brought us in, to make writing labs actually about writing. So over and beyond the years of the intervention, these plans became more detailed, laying out specific pedagogical cues for teaching with writing specifically, and for teaching more generally, like the timing of activities you see here on the right, 5 minutes for the introduction to creating the rubric, et cetera. As well as linking out to materials for the TAs and students' shared use, like these you see here. I didn't include a 2020 plan on the slide here because this is already more than enough text to comprehend at once. And also because I actually couldn't. The level of detail there would absolutely not fit on a slide in any legible way. But I think it's worth mentioning here because that was the year that Kelly, the tech writing expert in the group, took on organizing groups of lead TAs to take on the role that John and I had filled in previous years. So she would meet with them, small groups of them, and they together would sketch out new materials in advance of the larger full staff meetings as a way to invite TAs into this creation, but the ones that really wanted to do that work, so it wasn't overly burdensome for everyone in the weekly meetings. So as we pulled back, the staff engineered ways to concretize some of these practices. Next slide. These frequent conversations about the goals of each assignment and writing lab led in the second year of the intervention to a detailing and refining of those goals, both to guide the staff's own continued pedagogical innovations and to communicate with students. Slide, please. So here you can see the original course objectives of the 2018 website, where the extent of the learning outcomes for writing communicated to students is in the top right there. After the number 2, it just says to enable you to improve your writing skills. And then the letter of that statement was sort of fractured in nested locations all over the website where it was rarely remarked upon or updated. Next slide. So John had the fantastic idea, spurred, I think, by a paper he was leading that we co-authored with the TAs of the course at the time, to draft out clear and detailed writing learning goals and place them centrally on the new website. And so, as was our practice, we took what we'd been hearing in the staff conversations as a seed and brought a first draft back to the group to build on. And they did. These seem a more stationary artifact in some ways of the course than those that I just discussed, right? They're not continually renewed in the same ways that the rubrics are, but they, I think, offer potential touchstones for bringing new TAs into the fold each semester. Slide. So ultimately, we hope this case sheds light on the long trajectories of both individual and cultural change inherent in WAC work, and recognizing that possibilities for projects of this scope are institutionally situated and the roles of folks in the Zoom room here likely vary. I'd like to suggest a few things. For WAC professionals, we hope this case urges you to consider possibilities for longitudinal models of outreach that invite varied members of your community to participate in a range of legitimately peripheral ways that suit their changing needs over time. We think it's crucial to consider confluences of resources that can enable this kind of support and lasting regeneration of discourse throughout your community. For teachers or consultants trying to make change in a single course like this, we encourage you to consider 3 things. First, how to support the long process of moving from tacit to explicit concepts of writing and practices of teaching. Second, how to harness existing practices to build transformative change. And third, how to build durable communication channels for sustained inquiry, dialogue, and production. And last, for WAC researchers, we hope this work may encourage you to take up extended longitudinal transdisciplinary action research models. And with that, I'll turn it over to Megan.
Thank you. I'm going to drop a few things in the chat here. So the first is the access copy for my talk. And then the next are some resources that I'll talk about. They'll go. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, some resources that I'll talk about as we go. Yeah, so following Bruce's discussion of the IOLab research and intervention and Nikki's discussion of Physics 280, I want to talk through 2 different interrelated strains of our work that are ongoing that show how the transdisciplinary action framework informs our work both on the curricular and on the instructional level. So these 2 pieces are the development of a set of learning goals and values, shared values for writing in STEM, and the development of a graduate student course focused on research writing and writing pedagogy in STEM. So I hope to give a brief background of both of these projects and talk through how they informed one another before speaking to potentials for future follow-ups and interventions. Yeah, so next slide. Yeah, and continuing our geographically dispersed land acknowledgement, we wanted to end with an acknowledgement of the land the conference is based on. So Colorado State University acknowledges with respect that the land we are on today is the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute nations and peoples. This is also a site of trade, gathering, and healing for numerous other Native tribes. We recognize the indigenous peoples as original stewards of this land and all the relatives within it. As these words of acknowledgement are spoken and heard, the ties nations have to their traditional homelands are renewed and reaffirmed. CSU is founded as a land grant institution, and we accept that our mission must encompass access to education and inclusion. And significantly, that our founding came at a dire cost to Native nations and peoples whose land the university was built on. This acknowledgement is the education and inclusion we must practice in recognizing our institutional history, responsibility, and commitment. And I would just point back to the resources we shared at the beginning for ways to make these land acknowledgements more actionable. Yeah, it's the next slide. So the first piece of our work that I wanted to talk about is one of the ongoing projects of WAES has been the development of a set of shared goals and values surrounding writing in STEM. So these goals are intended to be a touchstone in mentoring and a starting point in conversations about curricular revisions, rather than explicit learning outcomes designed to be taken up wholesale in curricular syllabi. So the learning goals that you see here on the screen have also operated as a tool for our team to discuss expectations surrounding writing in STEM. They've led to conversations about different genres and contexts for STEM writing and perceptions surrounding disciplinary differences. So the version of the learning goals and shared values that you see here was first informed by physics faculty workshops, compiled and revised by our team. And then when I joined the team, I worked on coordinating focus groups to get feedback from more faculty members outside of physics on the framework. And then it's been revised since then. So this is the most recent version of the learning goals and shared values framework. So yeah, next slide. So in these focus groups that I mentioned, we began with a slow group reading of student work, which is informed by Patricia Carini's work in the K-12 setting, in order to ground the broader conversation around curriculum in specific examples of student work and to avoid generalizations. So we had focus groups with people in physics to kind of follow up on those initial workshops and see how their views of these learning goals as they were positioned in the framework have changed. And then with crop sciences, and then with civil and electrical engineering, and we specifically met with their curriculum committee that was undergoing revisions of the curriculum there. So yeah, so we began with the slow group reading of student work in order to ground the conversation in what was actually happening in student work and kind of slow down and look at specific features of student writing in STEM. And then we broadened out to a discussion of the learning goals and shared values, potential context for uptake, potential problems with the way that they were framed, and just generally had a conversation about how this connected to course goals and curricular goals. So faculty across the different departments generally agreed with the goals and values originally outlined by the physics faculty, with some differences that highlighted shifts in perspective on context and audience across the different department focus groups. So for instance, the civil engineering focus group members highlighted how audience considerations were kind of limited by a focus on academic audiences, and weren't inclusive of the city officials, contractors, clients, and members of the public that engineers communicate regularly with in the workplace. So our approach to these focus groups was informed by transdisciplinary action research in the fact that we had 3 joint goals: getting feedback on the learning goals and values, creating a space for surfacing these implicit experiences and knowledge about writing, and engaging with ongoing conversations about the place of writing in curriculum revisions. So one concern that arose during the focus groups, particularly in the physics focus group, was graduate students' preparation and training to be teaching assistants for courses that incorporated writing. So one faculty member in the physics focus group shared how he had never been given the impression that writing was important in physics as an undergraduate student. So therefore, he was concerned about graduate students entering the program and having to navigate both writing their research and writing assessment in their roles as TAs, without having had explicit conversations about writing or instruction in writing as undergraduate students. So the learning goals that I showed on the previous slide thus became a starting point in focus group conversations about how values and expectations surrounding writing are communicated between undergraduate students, graduate students, and in faculty, and in turn, how those different positionalities shape engagement in STEM. So as a result, the focus groups, along with the work with Physics 280 that Nikki talked about, and our interventions and mentoring as a whole, led the team to think through how we can better support graduate TAs in STEM as they give feedback on undergraduate student writing, as well as they give feedback on their colleagues' writing and their advisors' writing too. So in response, we developed a transdisciplinary graduate student course focused on both research writing and writing pedagogy, and delivered it for the first time this spring to 2021, which I hope to discuss in more detail next. So yeah, next slide. Yeah, this is a course, and like I mentioned, I have materials from the course, the syllabus, and some example assignments in that link that I provided. So it was listed in engineering, but open to students across STEM fields. And it illustrates, I think, a key point in our approach to WAC work. It does not segment graduate students' roles as researchers from their roles as instructors, but instead creates the space for graduate students to surface implicit ideas about their experiences writing in STEM, and talk about how those ideas inform their TA work in turn. So you can see more details about the course structure in the handout. It was discussion-based, and students worked collaboratively in shared docs to articulate their experiences navigating rubrics created by instructors, evaluating journals for article submissions, and refining their own writing processes. And like Paul mentioned, it was taught by John Gallagher, who's a member of our team, and an English writing studies professor. So following the transdisciplinary action research model, we also conducted research alongside the course, and that's what my role was in this work. So both to understand the impacts of the course and to better understand graduate students' backgrounds with writing instruction and where they were when they came to the course and why they took the course. So this research included surveys that were sent out at the beginning and end of the semester and incorporated into the instruction, as well as 3 interviews. And the first 2 were conducted during the semester and the final after the semester is over. And we also collected students' assignments, as well as examples of research writing they're currently engaged with alongside the course, and feedback that they've given on student work for those who had had prior TA experience, which wasn't everyone who came to the course. Yeah, so just as we hoped that the learning goals and values serve to surface implicit experiences with writing and give stakeholders language to discuss writing in the curriculum, students in the course discussed how explicit discussion of writing concepts gave them the language to approach research and instruction. So yeah, next slide. So in these 2 quotes, you can see 2 examples of students talking through how the course impacted the ways they think about writing. So Rahul, which is a pseudonym, came into the course with several years of experience in both science writing for publications and TAing for a writing intensive science course. So in interviews, he discussed how the class gave him the space to think through and talk about his writing process across contexts with researchers across disciplines in STEM. And similarly, Kathleen, is the second quote here, who is in her first year in the computer science PhD program and has a background in gender and women's studies as well as computer science, talked about how drawing on rhetorical genre studies notions of genre as social action facilitated connections across experiences in her field. For example, Kathleen talked about her experience working with her advisor and other graduate students on a paper and having discussion about using a citation to point to how model minority myths in computer science lead to the erasure of inequities within the field experienced by Asian American researchers. So though that topic was not the focus of the paper, which was focused on service learning within computer science courses, their footnote and citation served as social action, arguing for the relevance and importance of indexing that conversation. So she connected that experience to the repeated experiences of entering a class and judging expectations surrounding grading and assessment, the constant collaboration to audience expectations across contexts, which she describes as this practice of reading behind the scenes of writing. So thinking through these features of writing that they were already engaged with, and the course giving them kind of like terminology and a shared space to discuss those experiences. So overall, the course followed the pattern of the focus groups and the mentoring discussed earlier. And then it asked students to examine their own histories as writers and reflect on the ways their histories impact the goals and values that they center in the curricula, the features that they highlight in their rubrics, and the ways that they collaborate as writers in research groups. Yeah, so next slide. So to conclude in the ways that we see these strands of our work going forward, so with the learning goals and shared values, we plan to continue to map how this framework serves as a starting point in faculty mentoring and a touchstone in the work in our research group. In our continued research and work with Engineering 598, we plan to follow up with students to see how the work and discussions from the course intersect with future contexts. So the students in the course ranged from first-year graduate students to those who were on the job market when the course began. So there's one participant we plan to follow up with who's not yet had a TA position, while there's another who's working on framing writing within their job materials, and another who's just accepted a faculty position is currently working through how they'll facilitate collaborative writing in the research team that they're leading. Yeah, and it's a semester-long course, 2 credit hour course. Yeah, so as the graduate students move forward in these different contexts, we're interested to see how they enact their reflections on process and assessment in different ways. So we're also discussing different ways to continue to support this cohort after the first iteration of this course, potentially through ongoing writing discussion groups to continue the transdisciplinary conversations that's started in the course. And we're also scheduled to offer the course again in spring of next year. So we're analyzing the feedback and research from this semester in order to shift the way that the course is advertised and designed. So altogether, these 2 strands of our work, the learning goals and the graduate student course, show how continued conversations across disciplines push us to make connections across contexts, rather than segmenting curricular revision conversations away from student work or separating a graduate student's experience as a TA from their work in a research team. So going forward, we're hoping to continue researching conversations with faculty and students to find out ways to support the learner engagements more holistically. Thank you.
Okay, thanks all. And I think we have plenty of time for questions, comments, discussion at this point. If you want to raise your hand or put a message like an X in the chat space, kind of call on people if there are a lot of questions. I'm seeing one in the chat space. Is the course a full year, 1 semester? And is that in reference to the course Megan was just describing, the TA graduate course? Yeah, 1 semester. Megan, do you want to say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it's a 1 semester long course, but like I mentioned, we're thinking about ways to continue that support beyond the 1 semester based on students' availability and what they're most interested in.
One thing I think I might add is just that in discussing the course, some of the engineering faculty's first interest was in seeing the graduate students as TAs. And part of our collaborative conversation essentially pressed them to see that it was important to address the students as researchers and think about ways that they could take these ideas into their own writing, into their labs, which are also key mentoring contexts for both graduate and undergraduate students. Other questions? Thoughts? Daniel has his hand up. Yeah, go ahead, Daniel. Sorry.
No problem. Now I'm going to try to lower my hand. Did it. Nice. I have 5 questions, and I promise I'm not going to ask you all here. So whichever one of you feels like talking, I'll ask a question that I've got for you. Paul, you get 2, actually.
Go ahead. Nobody else is pushing, so carry on.
I'm wondering about the order of those workshop topics. And I'm thinking about it in particular with relationship to the topic on multiculturalism. I'm wondering what would happen if that was the second comment, because one of the things that I encounter a lot when I work with faculty and graduate students in mechanical engineering and electrical engineering is we've got a really broad population of students who are drawn from all over the world, who are experts in their technical field. And I love the opportunity to talk to them about the fact that engineering English is, it can be understood as a body of knowledge, and it's a topic that can be understood as something that people study. So just to address that kind of question in the context of the stereotype threat that's sometimes associated with particularly TAs who are on visa, I'm wondering if the order makes a lot of sense and it's all the common topics, but I'm wondering about making that a forefront topic and if that's a priority or a question for you.
I guess I would say in some respects that part of the ordering of the topics reflects sort of an interest in drawing people in and keeping them in. And that we've taken a lot of the lead on that from the engineering participants in the program. So questions of writing process and response tend to be really up at the forefront there. I would also say that as a program, we've been thinking a lot about how response to writing is a kind of critical nexus where issues of culture and race and other things sort of fall heavily on some students rather than others, particularly as in Nikki's example with the point deduction sort of response strategy that was being used. That those are the kinds of things that will really penalize people whose language doesn't conform very tightly. So we see that as actually kind of an initial wedge into those kinds of conversations. But yeah, and we have changed the order and the specific topics every time we've offered it, in fact. And we keep trying to take into account what's worked, how it's worked, how people have taken it up. Catherine asks here, can we view the videos on collaborative learning and/or the doc that Megan showed on writing across engineering and science? Are these in web pages that are open to the public?
I think Megan's is on our website, which I'll drop in the chat too if people want to check out some of the other resources that we have there, links to publications, our work. And I'll check in with Mats and Katie. I think currently the videos are set to be unlisted, but I think I can share them. I'll add them to our session page too, so folks have access to them that way.
Other questions? I think Daniel's got 4 left. Got about 9 minutes.
Share them with you.
What? Carrie?
They're in a Google Doc. I'm going to send them to you.
Okay.
Definitely.
I'm curious if other people have had experience with these kinds of long-term collaborative interactions. I know I attended Magnus's Gustafson's workshop on the first day of IWAC, which is a similar kind of longitudinal process. And if anybody had examples of that. So I think this is one of the things that we've been struck with. And I mentioned that I had preceded this by doing about 25 years of more conventional WAC work, building off of my graduate studies with Lily Bridwell-Bowles and Chris Anson, where we did workshops for faculty, we did workshops for graduate students. We occasionally got invited to consult with specific courses and had some extended and repeated opportunities that way. One of the things we were really struck by with the sustained mentoring that I think it's important to mention is, as we saw faculty take ideas and struggle with them when they tried to apply them. And the struggles were partially, practical questions of exactly how to apply them, but also partially dealing with these old mindsets about response or what they needed to do or things like that, that ended up like tripping them up and throwing them off base. And so it gave me pause to realize like what the afterlife of a WAC workshop is. Even an extensive semester long one that the faculty were excited about the ideas, attempting to implement them, but still struggling. And Nicole's experiences in physics, I think, are a good example. Matthias, the faculty member, had already had a genre perspective and was doing some really neat things from a writing studies perspective with that, asking people to write in genres of, congressional research reports and things like that. But yet had a lot of these practices that were problematic. And the iterative, really intense feedback was critical. Nikki, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that one of the continuing sort of long-term TAs in that course had taken the Center for Writing Studies graduate student writing cross curriculum pre-semester, like 2-day training, and had pretty much no memory of it. He didn't think that it played into what he did in that class at all. A lot of TAs don't necessarily feel like they have space to make changes in the course. And I would say that this course, Matthias was really very inviting of, sorry for the sirens, very inviting of the TA's agency and making changes to the course, but they just didn't see it that way because that's how it was running, and he didn't really make the connection between what he was learning there and what he could do in the class.
I'll say one thing too that we found in the early sort of sessions, resistance from some of the TAs to going away from the point totals because they had done them already. And one of the things we did in one of our workshops was to ask them to read a student paper and find the passive voice, which was a 2-point deduction. At the end of that, nobody was better than 50% accurate on passive voice. Passive voice is actually surprisingly difficult to recognize. And one of the TAs simply said that he really had no idea what passive voice was, so he just never took off points for that. So these were things that people were adhering to because they provided a kind of very simple exchange system to do this response, not because they were actually doing anything. And in the conversations, of course, wiping out passive voice in all engineering writing doesn't make sense either. It's a very common feature of a number of genres in engineering and STEM. So I think this is a kind of example of things that this did, but it wasn't like everyone was excited immediately about the new rubrics, but I think that they did really significantly change the way the course was being presented over time. Magnus, yes?
Yeah, I'd just like to add to what Nicole was saying and what you were saying about what I tend to refer to as faculty training courses and how sometimes they are so socialized into their genres and into their disciplines. So they no longer see the difficulty. They assign what they call a lab report, what is in fact an IEEE short communication, and they see the content, but they don't quite see the difficulty that the students meet when they change the assignment or when they change the expectations on an assignment. And well, we need to be wary of that in our various courses and seminars, etc.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely the case. And there's a lot of non-reflective practice by very professional people. When we did some of the initial slow reading that Megan was talking about in our WAES program, one of the things we did is we brought in some example articles from physics in Nature, which is one of the 2 lead journals. As they were kind of slowly reading through the first paragraph of the articles, most of the faculty in the room were kind of saying, this is a terrible, terrible article. It doesn't make any sense. I don't know what they're talking about. So we have this sort of image oftentimes of like this profession that agrees on standards and has a clear set of goals. I think we need to put a lot more pressure on that notion. So I think that the sustained interactions are really useful and surprising. I mean, I'm often surprised where the trip ups happen. Stefan had a comment on the passive voice. They couldn't do it and were surprised how many sentences were written in active. Yeah. I have to say, teaching a class for secondary English education students, I've also been surprised at how long it takes most of them, all of them, to actually recognize passive voice, though they've all been deeply socialized into the idea that it's terrible. Okay, I think we're perhaps at the end of our time here. I want to thank you all very much for your participation and your questions, and to encourage you to reach out to us if you would like to follow up and to look at the website for materials. We've got several papers there that are open source and really provide more detail about what we've done. And thanks to to Megan and Nicole and Bruce for all their work and for these presentations.